next term should conditions allow, of course, but that's how it is. Today, delighted to welcome Philip Cunliffe. He is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Kent. Distinguished publishing career, 6 books he has written, edited to his name, including his latest one, Cosmopolitan Dystopia. Philip has been at University for quite a number of years, but before that he was at the War Studies Department at King's College London, and also at the Defence Studies Department there as well. I think probably without further ado, I'm just pausing to let the arrivals in. I'll hand over to Philip.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me on the sound? Is everything okay? Sound-wise, yeah? Great. Well, so thank you to Professor Peter Salmons for the invitation, and thank you to the Institute for the invitation. It's very good, in fact, to be giving this talk to you face to face, and also speaking to, as well as speaking to the students who are online. Given the circumstances, it's great to see that we're still making collective efforts to ensure these kinds of discussions and debates go ahead. So the other privilege and benefit of being here is that this is an audience that I'm not really used to speaking to, because I understand from Peter that in terms of the disciplines that are represented in the Institute and the department, they're far-ranging. And so it's the first time, I think, that I'm in the position of being fortunate enough to speak to an audience about these themes, because the themes in which I'm going to talk about I've mainly presented to different kinds of audience in terms of the disciplinary and intellectual fields from which they come. So given the fact that my intellectual background is distant from what I presume are the research and teaching in the Institute, I decided that rather than present a research paper, and I discussed this with Peter, and particularly one that would be saturated in the technical vocabulary of my own field, which is international relations, I thought it'd be better to devise the talk as a lecture, because hopefully this will allow me to speak to more broadly to themes that I hope are of interest to the audience, as well as perhaps to risk drawing wider generalizations and inferences that are more difficult to do in the narrow confines of a research paper. And much of what I'm going to talk about draws on arguments that I made in the book that Peter mentioned, published in 2020, Cosmopolitan Dystopia, International Intervention and the Failure of the West. So it's also going to be old-fashioned. I'm not going to, been using slides so often on Teams and Zoom that I thought it would be refreshing to take a break from slides. So I'm going to deliver it just talking, if I can still get away with that. So let's see. So the title of the talk is The Disaster of Liberal Intervention ? Or Liberal Interventionism ? And what I want to do is to talk to that theme, but to talk to it, or to reach, I suppose, the question of how disastrous it has been by talking to themes of emergency politics, or the politics of emergencies, and what the long-term costs of politics of emergencies may be, which are obviously connected to, but not nonetheless different from, disasters. And hopefully that will pick up on interests within the audience, both in the room and outside the room online. So emergencies have been central to the conduct of international affairs and foreign policy for many decades. And the particular form that this type of emergency has taken in foreign affairs is most often that of the humanitarian disaster that necessitates an exceptionalist response, which is to say a political or legal response, which is a break from the routine functioning of the institution or the political order in question. And the kinds of crises that or the kinds of ongoing episodes that attract this kind of attention and this kind of thinking at the moment could be, say, the starvation and the conflict in the Yemeni civil war, the winter starvation in Afghanistan at the moment in the aftermath of the Taliban's overrunning of the country and the famine that preceded it, the disaster in Ethiopia as Tigrayan forces threatened to overrun the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, and so on. So there's a long, unbroken thread of emergencies in different parts of the world, and these thread of interconnected emergencies, they stretch back across decades, at least to the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, if not before. So when we think in terms of the politics of emergencies, we usually think in terms of domestic politics. It's easier to think about the politics of emergencies, I think, in domestic politics, or at least with respect to the costs associated with the politics of emergency. So typically the specific characteristics of states of emergency is what's seen to be most important. So the fact that they pose urgent and overwhelming problems is often seen, right, to pose all sorts of political risks in terms of our response to them. And typically these debates have taken the form, for instance, of the fact that the political response to emergencies might empower the state at the expense of the individual and the state at the expense of individual rights, that it will strengthen the executive at the expense of the legislature, that it will strengthen administrators rather than elected officials, administrators within the state security apparatus, senior civil servants, bureaucrats, and so on. The necessity of quick response in emergencies obviously limits the scope for deliberation and thought. And restraint and legal limits to power gives way to the need for executive speed and administrative discretion. Measures that are said to be time limited and time bound become normalized. And so that emergencies that are justified as being temporary aberrations instead become transformed and they become embedded into the institutional and legal context into which they erupted in the first place. So these are some of the typical problems and risks and dangers that are associated, as I mentioned, with emergency rule in liberal democracies. And of course, it's important to stress they're also part of the appeal of emergency rule as well, as they offer the opportunity to sweep away or transcend dissent. They offer the opportunity to bring to an end enervating deliberation and discussion, to draw close to processes of deliberation. They also offer the possibility for enhancing the power of all sorts of agencies, bureaucracies, and so on within the state. So everything that makes emergencies potentially threatening is also obviously what makes them very alluring, at least to certain social and political constituencies. So that's the way in which I think the politics of emergencies is frequently understood in the domestic context. And we can think of all of these debates with respect to, say, not only, say, the politics of COVID, but also, say, the global war on terror since 2001. These are many of the issues and debates that surfaced in the context of the American state's response to the threat of terrorism. So at this point, I want to put forward two propositions off the back of sketching out what I just did. So the first is that just as emergency rule carries risks in the domestic realm, so too it carries risks in the international realm too. So although the international order is not as institutionalized as the domestic realm, in the sense that there's no global sovereign or world state, it is nonetheless the case that emergency politics can also have deleterious consequences in the international realm too. The second proposition I want to put forward is that I also want to claim that we have political choices in emergencies. So I don't only mean that we must be willing to question the authenticity of any disaster or emergency, or to question how far any emergency might be politically instrumentalized, especially if we're to be able to properly address it and understand the specific risks it poses, but also that there are different types of emergency response, right? So irrespective of the character of any specific emergency, that doesn't immediately shape the character of the response. It doesn't dictate that the response has to take a particular kind of form. and that there are choices, in fact, in the form of response to any given emergency or disaster. And the fact that we have choices in terms of how we respond in the context of emergencies tends to get overlooked in the emphasis on speed and immediacy that usually comes with emergency. So I want to talk through these 2 points in turn. So if we begin with the first point about emergencies in the foreign realm and the risks associated with it. So as I already suggested, disaster and emergency have been central to the legitimation of Western foreign policy for the last 30 years or so. Relieving human suffering has been vital to justifying the role and the scope of what Western governments do around the world. It has also been central to the justification for war efforts across the last 30 years as well. And what I've called in the title of the talk, liberal interventionism. So military intervention for liberal causes rather than for, say, national self-interest. So military intervention has either been carried out or mooted in various contexts to provide protection to civilians under conditions of extreme duress, to defend the provision of humanitarian relief in the form of air corridors or safe havens. There's been military intervention to curb the suffering inflicted by, say, bombing, leading to the implementation of no-fly zones. Peacekeepers, blue helmets, have been tasked with protecting civilians in contexts of all sorts of depredation and conflict. Military intervention has been justified to end civil war and to punish various insurgents, rebel groups, and militias. And that the extreme military intervention has also been used to defend human rights, to eliminate the risk posed, existential risk allegedly posed by weapons of mass destruction. Military intervention has also been justified to root out tyranny, theocracy, and to defend liberal democracy. These are all the different ways in which military intervention has been justified in the context of as a response to the emergency posed by extreme forms of human suffering. And this is the range of justifications that have been given for the war waged by Western states over the last 30 years or so. And to think of the power of these kinds of arguments, right? I think we only need to think back a few months to the US withdrawal from Kabul as it was being overrun by the Taliban. So the fact that one of the most powerful criticisms made of the withdrawal of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was not so much, say, a civilizational or a conservative one. It wasn't that Islam, say, was gaining at the expense of Western civilization. No commentator that I know made that claim. Rather, it was a liberal one, right? That we were abandoning women's rights by abandoning Afghan women and girls specifically to the clutches of the Taliban, and thereby surrendering gains that had been made in terms of individual welfare and social progress over the last 20 years or so of conflict. Similar kinds of justifications now being offered in terms of shaping the provision of aid to Afghanistan under Taliban rule. So the emergency posed, say, by destitution and hunger in Afghanistan, and the threat that is posed to Afghan women and girls should be exploited by making aid to the new regime conditional, and thereby aim to reshape Taliban rule in a more liberal direction and at arm's length using the tool of foreign policy and aid. So my first point in talking through these various justifications given for military responses to disaster and to emergency was to say that there are political costs to emergency politics in the international realm. So even though there is no world state that could encroach on the autonomy of individuals, consistently organizing politics around emergency is still likely to push questions of power to the fore, right? Because by their nature, emergencies necessitate effective responses, and questions of efficacy mean power, right? Power is efficacious. That's the point of power. So emergency politics tends to prioritize questions of power over other questions. And the result of that has been, for the last 30 years at least, because emergencies tend to prioritize power, it has been to consolidate and elevate the role of powerful states, of wealthy and powerful states, and at least over the last 30 years, and it's still largely true today, with the partial exception of China, that it's the role of emergency in international politics has been to solidify the role of the West in international affairs. So the politics of the emergency provides an excellent legitimation of the status quo and of established interests. The other aspect of emergency politics in the international realm as much as in the domestic realm, is that it tends to strip away context in order to focus on immediate questions. It helps to reinforce the moralized aspects of human rights. So say that the problems that confront us in terms of the immediate problems of suffering and oppression are not understood in terms of, say, the failure or dysfunction of political institutions, long-term economic or social trends, or changing political identities, but in immediate terms, and that they need to be addressed in their immediate form that they take by tackling the most obvious threats in a particular conflict or a particular crisis. And this leads to all sorts of maladaptive responses, right? I mean, one example that I think is important here, say, is the skewing of a longer-term vision of aid, a longer-term vision of development in favor of development understood in terms of aid and in terms of the relief of immediate suffering, rather than a longer-term vision of using development to transform the societies in context. So in short, right, I want to say and stress that the politics of emergency has effects and costs in the international realm just as much as in the domestic realm. So even if we're not thinking in terms of the threat, say, posed by enhanced state power to the individual in the context of the war on terror, for instance, still in the context of the international realm, there are threats to thinking and framing international politics in terms of disaster and emergency. And that has been the predominant way in which Western foreign policy has been framed over the last 30 years. And that has serious political consequences to how we understand the nature of political power, to how political power is justified, and to understanding the nature of hierarchy and position and status in international politics. The second point I wanted to develop was that we have choices in how we tackle emergencies. And this tends to be overlooked, like I said. So in political, constitutional, legal theory, or at least in the political, constitutional, and legal theory that I talk about in Cosmopolitan Dystopia, in my book, the concept that is used to discuss the emergency response is called exceptionalism. So we're talking about a politics of exceptionalism, where there is a break with a pre-existing institutional or normative order. And I want to stress that the decision as to how we treat an emergency, what kind of political exceptionalism we pursue, right, is a question that is independent of the nature of any given emergency, right? So the two things are separate. And in my book, Cosmopolitan Dystopia, I use a twofold typology of exceptionalism. And here is where there's some kind of more technical vocabulary from political constitutional theory, but hopefully not too difficult to follow. So these two types of exceptionalism, there's normativist, what I call, at least in the book, is normativist exceptionalism, and existential exceptionalism. So in the first case, in normativist exceptionalism, exceptions are understood as temporary aberrations, right? So they are not understood, the emergency and the exceptional response to it is not understood as calling into question a norm-governed, fully legalized and institutionalized social and political order. So the exception isn't seen to call it into question. So here, a break with a pre-existing normative or institutional structure is understood to be limited and contained. It's not seen to undermine the case for that normative order. So in terms of international intervention, for instance, there are several examples. So one might be, say, India's intervention in the Bangladeshi War of Independence in the early 1970s, when they intervened against Pakistan and in favor of Bangladesh. They violated international law, but under the duress of extreme chaos on the border, Bangladeshi Bengali refugees coming into Indian territory, as well as the generalized disruption on the Indian border. Another example of this would be, say, the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia, which was again in the 1970s, when Vietnam overran the Khmer Rouge regime and overthrew the Khmer Rouge leader, Pol Pot. And again, in this context, right, Vietnam defended what was a violation of international law, a military intervention in Cambodia. They defended it on grounds of necessity, right? So they pled necessity, given the threat that the Khmer Rouge posed to the Vietnamese minority in Cambodia, and also the border raids that they were conducting and the challenges, the threats that they posed to Vietnamese territory. So essentially, right, in both of those cases, both Vietnam and India, in political and legal terms, they pled mitigation, right? So they violated, there was an acceptance that they'd violated international law, that they'd violated what was understood to be the normative structure of the international order at the time, but they pled mitigation, they pled necessity. There was no claim that these interventions, that there was a general principle underlying these interventions, or that their actions should have been taken as precedents for the actions of other states. They were not taken to justify a wider rule for the conduct of international politics. Another example of this kind of normativist exceptionalism, right, could be, say, the role of the US in the Second World War. So following the failure of the League of Nations to halt the slide into war in the 1930s, but prior to the signing of the UN Charter in 1945, you have what is effectively a normative interregnum, right, for the duration of the Second World War. So in this case, it's an interregnum between two international orders. But the absence, right, of this legally institutionalized normative order during the war was not seen to undermine the idea of having such a fully fledged institutionalized order. Rather, it was understood to be a separate pause between two orders, right? So emergencies in this vision of exceptionalism, they're understood as concrete problems to be resolved in concrete terms. In normativist exceptionalism, the emphasis is placed on normative order and exceptions are to be contained and limited. In this framework, political meaning and identity, they derive from the pre-existing stable institutionalized order. And like I say, so you can plead necessity or you can plead an interregnum that there is no existing institutional normative order, but the exception isn't seen to undermine the case for order as such, for normative order, for a concrete institutionalized legal and political order. The first type of exceptionalism. The second type of exceptionalism is existential exceptionalism. And this treats exceptions differently, right? It sees them as defining of political order. Emergencies are seen as being constant and recurring threats, and thus they give less scope to the idea of organizing social and political life through stable functioning institutions. So instead of emergencies being treated as these eruptions, potentially destabilizing eruptions within a pre-given normative, institutional, and legal context, this view of exceptionalism takes emergencies as constitutive of social and political order, and that emergencies give meaning and purpose to politics. So because this view sees emergencies as a constant recurrent feature of social life, it also means that there's a greater role for discretionary power, right? So that rather than seeing politics as something which should be conducted through established institutions, through established law within a given constitutional framework, it sees politics as being conducted on a more ad hoc basis, on the basis of discretionary power, on the basis of ad hoc decisions made by existing institutions of power. So in this framework, political meaning comes from the emergency itself, right? Because it's a recurrent, permanent feature of social life. And emergencies are framed rather than as abstract problems, as concrete problems, they're framed as ongoing abstract problems. So I want to say, right, that our problem in international politics is that our international affairs have been dominated by this last type of exceptionalism over the last 30 years or so. Emergencies have been given political meaning, and as a result, they've tended to erode the boundary between the norm and the exception, blurring the boundary between the two and making the conduct of ordinary politics more and more exceptional, more and more based on ad hoc decision-making rather than conducted through established institutions. And I want to illustrate in the final third or so of the talk, I want to illustrate what I mean by this and hopefully illustrate the stakes of what's involved by talking about the shift in international politics from humanitarian intervention to the responsibility to protect doctrine. Have people heard of the responsibility to protect doctrine just out of interest? Yeah? No? So the responsibility to protect doctrine is, as we'll come to see, it's the accepted, more or less legalized doctrine establishing what is the proper route for international institutions and for great powers to take in circumstances of extreme suffering and duress. I want to talk about how it evolved, and hopefully that will illustrate how international politics has shifted from one type of exceptionalism to another. The evolution from one to the other, I hope, illustrates this shift from normativist to existential exceptionalism. And hopefully in talking through it will also make, hopefully more, put flesh on the bones of the problems with existential exceptionalism. So although it began, beginning with the story of humanitarian intervention, although it began to be theorized in the 1970s, humanitarian intervention really only emerged in the wake of the Cold War. So as military intervention became easier to pursue, as geopolitical rivalry between the USSR and America diminished, military intervention became increasingly intertwined with peacekeeping. And military intervention became routinized and more recurrent. And what was striking about this development, right, that you had the growth of military intervention ranging from West Africa with Nigerian interventions in Sierra Leone and Liberia, through US intervention in Somalia, to French intervention in Rwanda, to Western military intervention in the Balkans, to Russian military intervention in Central Asia, to US military intervention in Haiti, all of this over the period of the 1990s. What was striking about this development was that in almost each case, intervention was authorized by the United Nations Security Council, which was a break from previous patterns during the Cold War, but it was also justified in terms that stressed its exceptional character. So the UN resolutions that justified these, that authorized these military interventions, they consistently refused to establish precedent and consistently stressed the exceptional character of each of these military interventions. Military intervention in defense of human rights, it was not seen as offering an alternative to the idea of state sovereignty. Rather, it was seen as a rupture or a break with established international law and custom that previously tended to prioritize the right of non-intervention. And the right of non-intervention was enshrined in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. So as a politics of exceptionalism, to that extent, humanitarian intervention was largely what I term normativist, right? It was focused on derogations from existing international law. It wasn't seeking to reshape international order around a new vision. And this proved to be unsustainable, right, in two respects. So first, the growing recourse to liberal interventionism of all various kinds increasingly eroded the pre-existing framework of the UN Charter, and this was to the consternation of many developing states, who tended to see humanitarian intervention, military intervention, as a tool of wealthy and powerful Western states. And in human rights, they also saw another Christological civilizing mission that was similar to that of 19th century imperialism, in which altruism was invoked in order to justify the exercise and extension of Western power. So intervention was constantly criticized outside the West for eroding international law and custom and for eroding the UN Charter framework, undermining the functioning of the United Nations and its associated diplomacy. The other aspect of the recurrent use of intervention was that as it became more routine, it also became more difficult to agree upon, right? So while initially military interventions were managed in such a way that the great powers of the Security Council ensured that they didn't antagonize each other when they conducted their military interventions, the more these interventions happened, the more difficult it was to avoid encroaching on one another's spheres of influence and to avoid tangling with other great powers. And this eventually happened with the NATO intervention over Kosovo in 1999. So in this intervention, NATO launched a bombing campaign against Serbia in order to halt counterinsurgency operations that were being conducted against ethnic Albanian pro-independence secessionists in the province. And this was the first time that a military intervention was undertaken in defense of human rights without the backing of the Security Council. And in this instance, it was because Russia and China, both permanent members of the Security Council and holding the veto, they both opposed it. They threatened to use their veto. So the breakdown of the consensus over Kosovo indicated that intervention threatened to heighten geopolitical rivalries, and thus it needed to be contained. So this led to the attempt to recohere the diplomatic consensus around intervention. And it was done by promoting the idea of the responsibility to protect. So the doctrine of the responsibility to protect was deployed as a device to try and stem the threat of geopolitical rivalry that it was emerging from the end of at the turn of the century. However, so it had been theorized, responsibility to protect had initially been theorized in the 1990s, but it was promulgated in this instance by an international commission, which was set up by the Canadian government and incorporated various Western luminaries, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, or ISIS. unfortunate naming, given the way things turned out. So the Commission framed the question of intervention, right, as a clash of rights. The rights of states to non-interference in their internal affairs and the human rights of individuals. So this was the way that the problem was understood, and how to resolve this clash of rights, how to resolve which set of rights takes precedence. This was the conundrum that they put themselves before them. And they resolved it with this ingenious sleight of hand, right? They said that all states, this is what the Commission said in formulating the doctrine, they said that all states by their very nature were intended, the purpose was to provide security and order for their peoples, right? And that given they already bore responsibilities to protect human rights by virtue of being members of the UN and signatories of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this was already built into the way in which they were expected to function. Where the Commission innovated was to say that where states failed in their pre-existing responsibilities, these duties then defaulted to the international community at large, including but not restricted to the United Nations. So from its publication in 2001, the responsibility to protect has become absorbed into UN institutions and practice. It's led to the appointment of new deputy secretaries general with special duties. There have been new expectations placed on peacekeepers in war zones in the form of protection of civilians. And it's been woven through the fabric of various resolutions, reports, and summit outcome documents. So insofar as it has been absorbed into the UN, it was also very effective at helping to cohere consensus, the consensus that humanitarian intervention had eroded. So in 2005, the doctrine of the responsibility to protect was absorbed into the outcome document of the World Summit that took place that year. And so what this means is that even those states that had vigorously opposed humanitarian intervention in the past, notably Russia and China, they signed up to it because all states that participated in the World Summit, all member states of the UN signed up to it, and 2 paragraphs in the outcome document of the World Summit embedded the responsibility to protect, which meant that all states were then legally obliged to follow the responsibility to protect as to how to respond to certain serious breaches of human rights. So the responsibility to protect is something the US, China, and Russia could all agree on, right? And it's also worth noting that Russia has explicitly begun invoking humanitarian justifications in its military interventions in Georgia in 2008, as well as in its support for secessionist rebels in eastern Ukraine, and also for the secession and annexation of Crimea. So the way in which the responsibility to protect in the aftermath of the World Summit, the next kind of peak for the responsibility to protect was evidenced in the NATO bombing campaign against Libya in 2011. And this followed in the wake of the uprising against the regime of Colonel Gaddafi. The UN resolution that justified or authorized the NATO bombing campaign, it made explicit reference to the failure of the Libyan state to abide by its responsibility to protect, which meant that this responsibility defaulted then to the international community, and in this case, to NATO. However, unlike Kosovo and Iraq, where both Russia and China would have vetoed UN authorization for that military intervention, here, in the case of Libya, they abstained, right? So they didn't vote in favor of authorizing the mission, but they didn't vote against it either. They indicated effective tacit acceptance by abstaining from the vote. The subsequent outcome of the intervention would seem to have proved the critics of intervention right. Yeah. So Russia and China were furious at what they expected to be a limited campaign to prevent Colonel Gaddafi from victimizing civilians and benefiting from his control of the air, turned into a de facto regime change operation. NATO became effectively the air force of the rebels who ousted Colonel Gaddafi. And the result has been permanent civil war in Libya for the last 10 years, still unresolved to this day. So bear in mind too, that as the responsibility to protect was being used to justify the intervention in Libya, this was also happening concurrently with the Syrian civil war, arguments about intervention in the Syrian civil war, as well as the Ukrainian civil war and the rise of ISIS, the jihadi insurgency in Iraq and Syria. So that talks through some of the detail of the responsibility to protect. But what is important about it in terms of what I've been speaking about in the talk is that it completed a shift from one type of exceptionalism to another. And it illustrates the dangers of one type of exceptionalism over another. It completed a shift from a normativist vision of exceptionalism to an existential exceptionalism. It recohered a consensus around intervention, but it did this by blurring the boundaries between the norm and the exception, by integrating exceptionalism into the functioning of political order as understood in a kind of as a routine and functioning given set of institutions. So the shift to existential exceptionalism is embedded in the responsibility to protect doctrine. It makes the exception the norm, and it makes the discretionary exercise of power central to the functioning of its political and legal institutions, as well as seeing humanitarian emergency as a recurrent phenomenon that justifies and necessitates the recurrent use of power. And this effect is achieved in a very simple way, right? It's achieved by the displacement of accountability. So in making the responsibility to protect the default to the international community, right? This is the idea that states bear responsibilities for protecting their people. If they fail, these responsibilities shift to the international community. In making the international community the default fallback for these responsibilities, it effectively makes states responsible for their peoples rather than responsible to their peoples, right? The way in which accountability is built into the doctrine shifts the way in which responsibility is built into the functioning of the state. In so doing, it displaces the central role of the people, the nation, the citizen body, whatever you want to term it, as the central locus of political power and the ultimate source of political and legal authority within countries. It also means it cuts away at the possibility of genuine political accountability. So in this conception of state power, citizens are essentially seen as passive receptacles of benevolence, of largesse, essentially at the mercy of states. They're seen as citizens or civilians are seen simply as objects that can be shunted around from one protection system to another. And the only possible role that is given to them in the doctrine of the responsibility to protect is that they can potentially stage hysterical rebellions, right? So they can stage insurgencies that could be designed to elicit international sympathy or support, intervention in their favor. But beyond that, they have absolutely no role. All agency is given to existing structures of international power, either the state in question or international institutions outside the state. So in short, right, it's a deeply paternalistic account of state power. And it's the result of this attempt to restructure our political institutions and international law by integrating the exception into the routine functioning of political order. I use this to illustrate the logic of these two types of political exceptionalism. But in principle, there's no reason that this account of these two different types of political exceptionalism couldn't be extended to other types of disaster response or to other types of emergency. But the costs of existential exceptionalism, as I've tried to indicate, are long-term and enduring and severe, and will tend to embed not only to make emergency be seen as a constant of social and political life that in turn justifies the constant use of discretionary power, but also that it will transform the relationship between citizen and state to the benefit of the state, and also by its very nature, will tend to legitimize paternalist conceptions of state power and paternalistic accounts of political authority, rather than accounts of political power or state power that are based on the idea of representation. So in the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, states have responsibilities for us, but not to us. And that's, I think, the most important critical point to be made about the responsibility to protect as a doctrine of state power. And that this has been the result of this evolution in the practice of political exceptionalism in international politics over the last 30 years. I haven't had time to talk about cosmopolitan dystopia, what I mean by that term, because it's linked to some of this discussion. I'll be happy to talk about it more if people are curious or interested in questions. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, thank you very much. So we have a question from the audience here. And also, I think there might be questions coming through on the webinar as well, which I think you will read out. David.
Yes, thank you for a very thought-provoking talk, which I'm still trying to assimilate because the international situation is obviously very complex. I'm wondering what you think about the situation in Belarus regarding the refugees there and the difficulty of doing anything about that in terms of external forces, and at the same time the situation in eastern Ukraine, where it appears that next month there will be a Russian invasion and the West is not going to participate in a war there apparently.
Do you want to address them immediately, or?
Yes,
yeah, okay. So thank you for the question. I mean, I can't claim any particular great expertise on the crisis in Eastern Europe, but I suppose I would say this. I would say that part of the way in which humanitarian intervention has functioned, I think, is precisely to avoid the responsibilities of having to deal with refugees under international law. So generally, military intervention, the way it's been reshaped over the last 30 years in terms of providing relief to civilians in war zones, carving out safe havens in various territories, offering military protection to refugee camps, all of this, I think, has been an odious development insofar as it's encouraged civilians to stay in situations of extreme, extreme threat, as well as encouraging and enabling states, neighboring states, as well as Western states, to relieve themselves of their obligations under refugee law and under the Convention on Refugees by essentially containing the problem in the zone of conflict. And so this is the other kind of aspect of humanitarian intervention, has been effectively that it's been a way of shedding responsibilities under refugee law by essentially encouraging civilians to remain in harm's way, offering promises that are very difficult to keep and are often broken. So that, I think, is one important contextual point about the immediate kind of crisis with the refugees in Belarus. And the second one as well is, if you look at, I'm not intimately familiar with them, but from what I understand, if you look at the demographic breakdown of the origins of many of the refugees coming into Europe, it's frequently from countries that have been subject to Western military intervention in one form or another. And I think that is also an important part of the legacy of Western military intervention. Part of that also, obviously, is what's happened in Libya, the fact that Libya has effectively been turned into a holding pen for migrants, and that there are militia sponsored by the European Union at the moment in order to try and contain the refugee problem, to prevent it from reaching European shores. So I think those background factors have to be taken into consideration. And then briefly on the threat posed to the Russian intervention in Ukraine and the possibility of renewed war, I'm not convinced that that there is a genuine risk of war. I mean, obviously, in circumstances of tension, it's always escalation is always possible, and certainly, I think there is much too much belligerence in the crisis at the moment. But at the same time, it seems to me, and what's been underreported, is that Putin has made his intentions very plain. So he said that if he wants a guarantee that Ukraine will not be integrated into NATO and that NATO military infrastructure would not be stationed in Ukraine. So that seems to me the purpose of the kind of saber rattling on the border. And so that is, I mean, I think that's beyond all the kind of the agonizing over a potential response. I think that's essentially the question to focus on for Western states, is whether or not they're willing and able to commit to that. And if so, perhaps it could be part of a larger rapprochement that could bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, and who knows, perhaps even in Syria.
First on the left and then on the right.
My question is sort of two-part. To what extent do you think this development was intentional as far as it maintains a sort of status quo of power? And if you do think it's an intentional development to an extent, could this be sort of characterized as sort of furthering of like the Hobbesian Leviathan insofar as they're sort of moralizing coalition?
What a great question. So I didn't get into the details of the kind of dig into the foundations of political theory in the talk. I do a bit more of it in the book. But for those not familiar with the idea of Leviathan, it's one of the most, one of the original kind of modern justifications for state power. And the idea of Hobbes, the idea of the Hobbesian Leviathan in Hobbes's political theory is the idea of that we contract out of the insecurity of the state of nature, and we hand over some rights to the state in order to protect us, to provide our security. And what's striking to me about the idea of state power that's developed in the responsibility to protect us, it's even more authoritarian than that developed in Hobbes's theory. So Hobbes was famously indifferent to questions of democracy and resistance. And essentially the idea of consent in Hobbes's theory, that consent was extracted on a one-time basis. You consent to the state providing security for you, and after that, that's it. Your rights are effectively given to the state in return for the security that the state provides. And this is the basis of political and order and the social contract. In the responsibility, that there is some exceptions, right? So in Hobbes's theory, if the state fails in its duty to provide security, you no longer owe obedience to the state. So there are conditions in which political loyalty in Hobbes's framework fall away. There's no such kind of exceptions in the responsibility to protect. So there's no possibility, the idea of revolt or resistance or circumstances in which political loyalty isn't owed to a state authority. Those circumstances don't exist in the theory of the responsibility to protect. Rather, it's understood purely in terms of the actions of states, whether it's the state that happens to occupy a particular territory or states further afield. So it's, in many ways, I think it's a more chilling vision of state power than that even in the old Hobbesian kind of vision of state power. And with respect to how far it's an intentional development, it's an interesting question. And I suppose I think what it shows more is, I think that it's more, the responsibility to protect developed as an attempt to cohere diplomatic ground around the scope for military intervention. They were looking for a solution to a problem. So it was an ad hoc response, and I don't think it was cunningly devised in order to legitimate or extend the power of old colonial states or the existing great powers of the day. And I think the lesson, I suppose, of that is that it seems to me there's very little intentionality to the actions of many states at the moment. And the more that we rely on, the more that politics is legitimated through emergency, the more that these questions of long-term vision and the desirability or feasibility of particular types of political or social order, the more those questions are displaced, because there's the immediate emergency to deal with. And in my field, in the context of international politics, what this means is that all these questions of long-term institutions, long-term development, they're always displaced and kicked further down the road because there's an immediate crisis to resolve. Rather than thinking about systemic transformation, how to resolve the context that gives rise to these recurrent conflicts, we think in terms of containing and limiting suffering in these conflicts. And that's the danger of thinking in emergency terms. All of our long-term kind of vision is eclipsed and exhausted purely by thinking in terms of immediate necessity. So hopefully that's a bit of a long-winded response, but hopefully it addresses your question. And the short answer is no, I don't think it's an intentional development. Its effect, I think, is to relieve political leaders and states from having to offer anything meaningful and coherent, because they can rule on the basis of immediacy.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, because you mentioned obviously the NATO bombing campaign in Libya, and that it was accepted by the Security Council, and so that of course it's still a situation situation, but I'm wondering kind of what would be the alternative to military intervention? What would, it's obviously a difficult question, but I guess I'm asking for your opinion on what would kind of resolve the situation without actually going into military forces.
Yeah, so I'd give a two-part response. The first part is I think that the geopolitical context for military intervention is radically different from what it was before. So before, there was cooperation on the UN Security Council was partly what enabled these UN authorization for military intervention. So given the fact that relations on the UN Security Council are much more fraught and tense as a result of the war in Ukraine and the war in Syria and growing geopolitical rivalry between China and the US, it means that we're more likely to see military interventions that are more ad hoc, more regional, and that are less likely to enjoy the support of the United Nations. So the issue is that the conditions in which the question in which we can kind of think about those questions has changed radically. The other aspect of it is that it's not so much that, I think the Libyan intervention was a disaster, right? And I think the outcome of the intervention proves that you've had a 10-year civil war as a result of a military intervention. It was a predictable outcome. In the sense of the fragility of the Libyan state, the lack of cohesion. The only thing that cohered Libyan society was this very kind of eccentric and fragile regime. So it was predictable, this outcome. Now, all that said, what I'm not really arguing about any specific military intervention, right? So I'm not saying that military intervention in general can never offer something. And I gave the example, I think, say the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia that destroyed the Pol Pot regime is probably something to be welcomed, right? And welcomed at the time and welcomed since. What I'm saying rather is that how the intervention is conducted and how it's understood and justified is what's important. So the Vietnamese never made a case that we had to restructure international order around what they did in Cambodia. But that is what the Americans have essentially, and Western states have argued. They've demanded that international order be reshaped around the military interventions that they've done. And the consequence of that reshaping has been drastic. And Libya, in fact, is a consequence of that reshaping of international institutions around these abstract hypotheticals. And so, this is the way teaching has been conducted for years, in fact, on these questions. I've lost count of the number of seminars I sat through as an undergrad or a master's student, where it would begin by, there's a genocide somewhere. What are we going to do about it? Right? And that is the way in which the responsibility to protect doctrine is framed. It's framed around abstract hypotheticals that necessitate the reorganizing of social and political order to make intervention easier. And what I'm suggesting is that we shouldn't try and make intervention easier, that the bar should be very high for intervention, because the costs of making it easier are tremendous, disruptive. So if there is to be intervention, it needs to be contained. We should think about it in concrete terms. And we certainly shouldn't try and adapt our institutions to make military intervention easier, which is what we've done.
What's the role of the international NGO community in kind of in our, I suppose, military intervention on the basis of kind of humanitarian ideals?
Yeah, so again, it's not my area of expertise is more states than NGOs, but certainly I think there, with one or two exceptions, I think, say, the International Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières that adapted their policy in various circumstances. I think to a great degree, many of international NGOs have been very complicit in the growth of military intervention, and even to the extent that they've become dependent on Western military power and the largesse of wealthy states in order to conduct essentially Western foreign policy. And very famously, there was the quote by the late former US Secretary of State, Colin Powell, when he described NGOs as a force multiplier. So following the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, he talked about the role of NGOs in Afghanistan. He talked about them as a force multiplier, which meant that from the viewpoint of the Pentagon, they were entirely part of the US war effort. They saw no distinction between US troops on the ground, what they were doing, and what the NGOs were doing as well. And so I think by their own actions, they've eliminated, they've undercut their own role. They've eliminated their scope as neutral agents. They've brought civilian kind of aid workers into, they've put them in harm's way and made them targets frequently in conflicts as a result of the compromises they've made with the use of with military power. And so it's a very important part of the story and one that's often overlooked.
Time for one very quick question at the end. Is not online there? Any further questions? Well, that's going to really like to thank you really for a really interesting and thought-provoking. Oh, sorry. Just slipped in at the end. Yeah.
So this is by Jacob, and his question is, if the standard operating procedure isn't working, what approach do you suggest instead?
If the standard of what procedure?
Standard operating procedure is not working, what approach would you suggest instead?
So I suppose this is it's another version, I suppose, or a similar version of the question that was raised by the lady in the middle about what is the response, what are the alternatives to military intervention? And again, I mean, I think I would throw it back at the questioner, because it seems to me we have now 30 years of evidence off the back of recurrent military interventions, and the outcomes have been generally terrible. I mean, if we think about what's happened in Iraq, if we think about what's happened in Syria, if we think about Afghanistan and Libya, there's very little to show for decades of recurrent Western military interventions that have been justified on relieving extreme duress and justified in terms of human rights. So the immediate alternative operating procedure would be to stop thinking in terms of resolving problems through the use of military force. And when that connection was made, the idea that human rights should be seen as, the relief of human suffering should be seen as something that's amenable, soluble by military power, that was a terrible connection to make, and has set the precedent for a very warped vision of international politics for the last 30 years. So that's the connection I want to cut. I don't want us to think of rights in terms of military power. I don't want us to think in terms of using military power to relieve human suffering.
Okay, well, I think right on the hour, so one very quick one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without getting into the details too much, given that we're at the end of the talk, but I mean, there were alternatives in Libya. The African Union was trying to mediate the conflict, for instance, and they were deeply aggrieved by the fact that they were effectively shoved out of the way by the determination of NATO to wage its air campaign. There were possibilities for a diplomatic solution. Perhaps Colonel Gaddafi could have even been prevailed upon to step aside, and the Gaddafi regime might have stayed in place. But it seems to me that given that we know the outcome of the last 10 years of war, it's worse. And I think this is, I suppose this is the note to finish on. Colonel Gaddafi was one of the worst Arab dictators. So to achieve an outcome, a situation in Libya that is worse than what Gaddafi had, that is quite an achievement in itself, right? And so I think that also needs to be borne in mind, that the fact that what has been perpetrated by the exercise of Western power in Libya is worse than what came before. So on that, there is, I think there's little dispute.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Sure, yeah.
So I did you have a few questions, I think, to come over to the house.